This is very much scratching the surface of 20 years and hundreds of interviews that I've produced. Most of them in this format that I'm going to show you today. There's a lot of exceptions. There's a lot of other scenarios. This is not a broadcast scenario. This is a very cinematic documentary production. I want to show you the higher end of it. And then when you go work for like KBCH Cake or something and you throw a camera on your shoulder and you just get a real quick, this is what happened today, you can always dial that back. But I want you to start with the highest level production value that you can. And then depending on your location, depending on your story, depending on your time, your resources, your team, you might have to scale it back. But when I can, I want to go as far as I can with it, whether it's the lighting, the audio, the questions, the number of interviews, the camera angles. When we got lucky and landed Mike Love one day and only had him for 30 minutes, I set up 6 cameras. And for various reasons, and it was a lot of stuff that we just knew we'd never get that interview back. And it could be a camera fail, it could be a card fail, anything. So we went really big. But we've had to go to scenarios which you might find yourself in where you just have your DSLR, one camera, and maybe an audio, like some sort of ambiance for light where you're opening a blind or a door to the outside as your key light, and everything in between. I'm going to hit you with as much as I can, but ultimately when you get out and produce your interviews, you're going to have to be adaptable. You're going to have to think on the fly, and you're going to have to work with what resources and story you have. And we've talked about some of that with Adam doing an interview where the guy would just give yes, no answers. Already a bad start. So yeah, let's start at the very top. The most important thing is safety. This is not a perfect, safe set in any capacity. Cords all over the place is the very first thing that stands out. The way it's been described to me by the fire department is treat it like running your vacuum. If you're gonna have extension cords out, don't have them running into like a microwave. But if you have them, using them temporarily, and you run through, do your process, and then clean it all up, then that's acceptable. But basically, you don't want to plug all this stuff in, say I'm good to go, and then go home for the night. That wouldn't be responsible at all. Closed-toed shoes. I like wearing layers. You often can't control your environment. And skipping ahead a few steps, I like to kill all of the AC units, the furnaces, any fans. We definitely have some interviews that get really hot, get a little cold. Cold's better because then you don't have people sweating all over the scene. But you got to do that. You got to keep that stuff in mind when you're talking about your audio getting ruined when the furnace kicks on, or even a refrigerator kicks on. It just depends. And that kind of leads into location scouting, which will just be briefly part of all of this today too. Gloves. I always wear gloves. I can't tell you how many blood blisters I get from tripods, silly things like that. But if we're working with our big Joker 800, this light will ruin your day if you don't have gloves on. I've seen this light make the wall smoke when another instructor was bouncing it off because they're so powerful. So they'll start fires, they'll absolutely burn you really bad. Just like if you're messing with these lights, you have to have not just gloves, but really, really good gloves. Those are the kind of things that can absolutely ruin a project immediately when somebody gets hurt. If you're injured, I was walking into a set one day carrying a bunch of gear and a rush, way too much coffee, slammed my finger in the car door, and had to spend the whole day with just my throbbing thumb. If you can prevent those things by not rushing, we have a rule, no running. Another rule, no yelling. You don't want to freak someone out. Those kinds of things can keep it smoother, and if it's safer, everyone goes home healthy and happy, not injured, then the project will be better. And it's better to go a little long than to start running and tripping over stuff. And you hurt yourself, you're going to damage equipment. It's all part of the process of, give yourself plenty of time if you can, and be safe about it so you don't have to rush around, so you don't have to yell back and forth, and you don't have to run. We're shooting, just to go around the room, we have a little GoPro Hero 11. This is a really powerful action camera. What I'm using it for today is simply behind the scenes time-lapse, shooting 1 frame per second, so I can speed it up and show the process of the day. It could be used for training purposes, it can be used for marketing purposes, promotional, that kind of thing. I love that little thing, it works great. but it's extremely limited in all the stuff you can do. It came with a microphone. I think it just went right back into the box, into the desk. C100 Mark I for, again, behind the scenes. I love that camera. Adam's got one checked out, or is working with one with projects for a few reasons. One, it doesn't have it has unlimited record time, depending on your power and your media. And it takes 2 card slots, unlike your DSLRs. So you can have it relay media from one card to the next and keep running. You can also have it record to both cards simultaneously, which is really popular for our live events, because you can't go back and do it again. If you're doing that wedding, concert, and you can't afford to miss that shot, it works great for that. C100 Mark II, the newer version, not a lot different, but it does have more frame rate options. It has a better electronic viewfinder, EVF. If you hear me say EVF, it has a better EVF. It's more mobile. It has a better screen on the back, whereas these cameras, the C100s, are about a 10-year-old model, and so you can get them now used under $1,000, but brand new about $2,500 or so, where I think when we purchased them, they were about $6,000. But they're still really awesome. They shoot just 1080p, so that's kind of one of the deal breakers for them, because they can't do 4K, but they have a 4K sensor, and when that's scaled down, it looks really nice. It's a really clean 1080p image. One of my favorite workhorses that we've had in the program, the Panasonic EVA-1, we bought that in 2018. They still have not come out with a new version. They've done a lot of updates for the firmware, software, but they haven't come out with the second one because this one still checks a lot of the boxes. I don't like the color coming out of it quite so much, but this camera just always works. The batteries last forever, dual card slots. It has a 5.6K, 5.3K, somewhere in there, sensor, and it scales it down to 4K, so it has a really nice 4K image, and a lot of variable frame rates. Does not have an electronic viewfinder in the same capacity that C100s do, so you're stuck with just this monitor. That's one of the things I don't like. It's really bad outdoors. That's where a hat comes in helpful, depending on what scenario you're working in. One great thing, and this is important when you're shopping for yourself or you're putting your kit together, they both, all 3 of these take the same lens mount. So I could switch this lens over here, I could switch this one over here, depending on my scenario. Since they have a Canon EF mount, which also has a lot of adapters if I got other lenses involved, then that helps like open up your glass options. And that is as important as anything else involved. So you haven't used these yet. We're shooting with a prime, 85 prime today for our tight shot. Let me show you how much tighter that is currently. And for camera 2, I like to go a little more emotional. Give it a second here. See how much tighter that is? You're gonna get a lot more emotion out of that shot. It's gonna be used a lot less often. Probably in a ratio, somewhere probably about 25% on camera 2, 75% on camera 1, depending on how your interview is going, okay? One of the things so camera 1 being this wider one here, when we have the prime, let me skip back. When we have the prime, it is only an 85. I can only adjust exposure and focus. I cannot change the focal range. I have to move it. But I can adjust depth of field with my focus with my f-stop, T-stops on cinema cameras, photography for f-stop. But it's a very powerful camera in that it's what they call fast, and it lets a lot of light in. And it can get really low depth of field. So I have a really distracting background over there. There's nothing adding to the story. I mean, if I'm interviewing one of you as a film student, sure, it'll work. But if I have a way larger depth I don't want this like tripod and cloth back there. So if I lower down my f-stop, more things are in focus, and I don't really need that. But they're very specific lenses. So if it's a 14, it's a 14. If it's an 85, it's an 85. Now, I have a variable cinema lens on our camera 1. Give that a second. So we can go anywhere from a 20, we're at a 20 now, all the way into a 55. I like that. I like to have those options on camera 1 because, again, it is my main camera. If I can make it work that way, I usually try to sit, even if I'm not operating it, when I'm directing, I try to sit near that camera. And I like to have our talent across the frame. So can I have someone volunteer to come be our interviewee? A few things that I like to go over. I like to have the eyes near the top third. So you guys know we talked rule of third with composition. Photography, it's the exact same rule of third. I want to have the eyes towards the top third. Nothing drives me more crazy than someone just framing someone up and their head's on the bottom with a bunch of negative space up there. You better need that negative space for like a graphic or something, or it better be something specific, or even mockumentary-wise, maybe it's something comical. If you're acting like an amateur crew or something. I don't want to just go straight on. I see that a lot. I see people stylistically go straight down the middle, where Andrew would be looking kind of as just staring straight at me. And I just watched a documentary recently with Navalny, the anti-Putin protester who's in prison right now. They framed him, it looked beautiful. I think it was on HBO. We should put it on the list. But they framed him up exactly straight on, and it looked really cool. For whatever reason, it worked great for that story. Very low depth of field. I'll try to find some images of it. But for me, my style, I really like to have them on one of the thirds, doesn't matter which. It does matter if we're having a conversational feel. But I like them on this third for this one, looking across frame. So I'm going to be talking to Andrew right over this side of the camera so that he's looking across the frame to me, but it almost feels just right over the lens. You don't want to have your actor or talent look right at the camera. It's not a good approach. Many of them are not professional on-camera talent, or otherwise they wouldn't be a great documentary subject. Might have a farmer, might have an artist, might have an athlete, politician. They're a little more comfortable usually. In that case, have them not stare right down the barrel of the lens. Have them look just over it at you at eyes. That makes them feel like they're having a conversation. So this is a nice start to my frame. So I don't like that it's off kilter. I want it to be level. And when I'm like this, what's that called? Do you guys remember what that's called? So a Dutch angle usually means something's about to change. Something's about to go bad. Bad guy's about to win. Bad guy's being introduced. The Dutch angle might mean the conversation's twisted poorly. But if you have a Dutch angle in a documentary, it just feels a little cheap to me. I don't know. Much of this is subjective, as I say all the time. How you guys choose to set up and frame your stuff can be unique to yourself. You don't always have to go with my very opinionated thoughts. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to widen up that depth of field a little bit. See how the background's falling off? If I go tighter, or if I go with a higher T-stop, I like that look lighting-wise, but I don't like that I can see the C47 clothespins in focus. I want to kind of distort that. And that also comes with, where do I put this chair? I do not want him up against a wall. You don't want to block him in. Even when we interviewed an author in his hotel room a couple years back, anything that wasn't bolted to the floor in that hotel room got moved, from lamps to couches to chairs. The only thing that didn't move was the bed and the counter. And so we had to take pictures of our whole set and document everything so we could put it back so he didn't have to pay some fee. But basically we wanted to get him away from the wall next to our window because we had some nice natural light, and we restructured that entire scene in this tiny little hotel room with a crew of 4. And we had Joey's wheelchair and all this scenario that we had to work around. And it came out really nice. So it was working with what we had. We didn't have a big studio, but when you do, you get their butt off the wall. Last week we discussed you might have difficult talent. In Africa, our guy was not leaving the wall. His chair sat next to the wall, even though it was just a little wooden chair. That's where his chair sat. That's where he sat. We weren't going to lose that story for my framing and composition, issues that I have. So we just sat and shot him against that wall, against our normal choice. So do what you have to do to get the story, but if they're going to work with you, so right away I tell them, take the glasses off. But if he's not, you're okay, you can leave them on right now, they're really bright. But you don't want to have stuff like that unless that's their image. If they're that kind of rock star and they're always wearing glasses indoors because it's just that cool, then that's different. But if they have reading glasses on and you know they don't typically wear them, try to get them to take them off. Otherwise, we're going to be moving these lights around and the camera around to try and not get reflection. You've got to see the eyes. It's so important that you can see the eyes if that's something you can do. We're shooting it, and this is ultra high def. 3840 is not 4K by definition. It is smaller. 4K is 4100 across. We're doing 23.98 or 23.976 for our frame rate. That's the cinematic frame rate. A lot of documentaries might be in 30. A lot of news might be in 30 or even 60, depending on where they're at. Now, that 23.98 could be 25. If you're in a PAL setting like Europe, other places in the world, they do 25 frames per second. In America, we shoot 23.98. I don't think I could ever notice the difference on a film that has it, but that's just something that plays better with, I think, their frequency of their television going through. So I could be wrong about that. We're doing vlog, so we're shooting in log format. That gives us more latitude in post for color, but and the image coming out is going to be a lot more gray and flat. It's not going to be nearly as vibrant or as much contrast. MOV, MP4, RAW, any of that kind of stuff, it's just kind of whatever. 420L, so we're shooting a really light codec. We're not doing a lot of colors. This is great if we're going for a really long time. Yesterday we recorded a presenter, a couple of presenters on campus. I did not need the highest quality because it went an hour and 15 minutes. And that file was still 30 gigabytes in 1080. So if I'd done 4K at the highest codec, it would have been 100 and some gigabytes for just people doing a quick talk. The circle indicates that we're recording. The 1 is saying that I'm in card slot 1. I don't have card slot 2 being used, so that's not mentioned. 190 minutes is what I have left. Again, these cameras, because I have them hardwired in, they will run until the media runs out. There's no relay, just because of the fact that we don't have 2 cards, so that would be recording from one card to the next card. And then time code, I'm not going to use time code. I know some people in the industry, they'd get anxiety. I'm going to use a clapper board, and that's how I'm going to sync my audio, and that's how I'm going to sync all my cameras, is that spike. All the cameras are recording at least a reference version of audio, and that's how I'm going to sync all my stuff together. Timecode could sync it all in post for you, but timecode can slip and it can get off, and this is a whole nother conversation for another day, but I personally don't like using timecode. Bigger productions, working with multiple studios, multiple sets, all this stuff happening, timecode is going to be used quite a bit. And this is where my battery image would be. Let me just pop it off. And you can see, so now it's battery, but since I'm wired in, hopefully it goes back in because it's a little bent after 5 years and lots of projects. So that tells me that I'm wired in. Very important if I need to be wired in and that's not showing up like that, that means I better get my batteries charged. Always have a battery included too. If someone kicks the cord, if the cable comes loose, all these things can happen. None of these cameras have locking power or locking HDMI because SDI locks in, HDMI typically doesn't. So anything can pop out, and that's why I want to have my backup plan. So having a battery in there will switch that right over. When I pulled that cable, the camera didn't die. If I got lazy and just didn't have the battery, I would have lost my shot. Down here, got audio kicking through. I'm not using this audio in post other than to sync everything together. So the audio is low quality, very low. In fact, the audio that we used yesterday for the speakers was straight out of camera for that one, and it had this like little tone kicking through. It wasn't great. But it enables me to make sure that I'm syncing it up with my clapper. Again, 23.98 for frames per second. The other one is going to say 23.98 because that's how I set it up. If that says 60, then I'm going to be shooting 60 frames per second on a project base of 23.98. And it will convert it, and then you got to do some math. You got to increase it by 250% to get it back, and it just won't look quite right because you still have way more frames in that frames per second, which leads also into shutter speed, our exposure triangle. In this case, shutter degree. On our cinema cameras, I typically just keep it 180. This goes back to the film days where a whole 360 was a wide open gate, all the lights coming in. And that's how your shutter is going through. 180 means it's half closed, which goes back to us having double shutter speed. So this would be exactly right at that 48 shutter speed when it's 180. I know that's pretty advanced cinematography stuff, so I'm not going to quiz you on that, but this is just going through the menu so you know what everything is. The next one, ISO 2500. Would that be high or low on your T6i? Thank you, Jaden. That is way high. Your image would be very grainy, maybe unusable if you went all the way up. However, one of the great things about the EVA1, it has dual native ISO. So I believe it's 800 and 2500. I could be wrong. There's different ISO settings depending on the camera brand. We have 7 or 8 different cameras. But 2500 is a really high ISO for that top end, but that enables me to let more light in so that I can hopefully lower my depth of field to be a little more cinematic. So by having it at the ISO of 2500, I can have a softer background. If I went to 800, then I would have to open it up. All right, so I'm switched it over to the lower ISO native of 800. So what I can do to let more light in to compensate, that'll lower that depth of field a little bit for me. Get my focus in the right spot. The focus points on this are great. They're little square green boxes, and the bigger the box, the more focus it is. The softer or no box means it's not in focus. But I'll show you that more here in a second. 56K, what's that? 5600K, what's that? Our white balance, yeah, thank you. Our temperature. 5600 is the natural light. That's what we've decided. See, that's what we've decided is daylight and natural. If I go lower, will it be colder or will it be hotter? Yeah, lowers it. The way I remember it, lower temperature, colder. That's pretty standard. So if you go up, actually it's easier to set up on the. Where's my? I'm going to switch over real quick to the C100 and show you that color temp shift. Hopefully. There it goes. So I moved him around a little bit. This isn't exactly where I want camera to, but just so we can talk color real fast. Now he's at a 3800 on this one. I'm not sending any information through. This is what we call a clean feed. So if I'm going out to a monitor that's, say, at the sports arena for a camera for a game, Dylan lecture, then I want that clean feed. But as I go up, watch him get way warmer. And I'm sitting at about I'm trying to go all the way that I can on this camera. We're at about a 12,000 there, and it keep going. Way too warm for my subject that I want to do. It's very easy to adjust color tone. It's super easy with the eyedrop tool, depending on what you're in. However, it's not always easy to match. And so in this particular case, these cameras have way different color science from one another. Canon's known for being really good for Caucasian skin tones with reds. They're probably most popular amongst, if you're in the wedding industry, you're going to see a lot of people with all the whites and things like that use it because it really works great for that particular skin tone. And then the EVA1, I don't like the colors coming out of it quite as much as I do the Canon, but it still works really nicely. So he's sitting around, let's go ahead and, I'll do that in a second. He's sitting around a 5600 now, and we have those matched. They're not going to look the same because C-Log on this camera is a little different than V-Log coming out of the Panasonic system. So I'm going to go back to this setting. And again, I want him to look across screen over to me. So framing that up is really important. And then the other thing that I noticed that was happening at the football game when we were testing on Thursday, they had 2 cameras side by side. They didn't have 180 degree on their shutter speed. So one of them was like at a 160 and the other one was at 1/60. That image is going to cause different flicker. I need these cameras to have essentially the exact same settings outside of where their focal points are. Or sorry, just their just what millimeter that we're shooting from. So I'm on an 85 here. If it has the connections, this blank space down here could tell you what your focal point is. That's at 20. The max I can go is 55. So no matter what, the 85 is going to be 30 above that, even if I'm capped out. Some rough math for you. You either want, when you're doing two camera angles, you either want one of them to be 30 degrees off from the other one. I don't want one at 85 and one at 80. That's not going to do us any good. It's going to be jarring for your audience, and it'll create more of what looks like a jump cut. And jump cuts are for basically people in a cinema world, you can pass time through. YouTube world, you're just too lazy to set up a second camera or to re-record your talk and your vlog, so they do a lot of jump cuts. I do not want to see jump cuts. I want to see you switching from camera to camera for reasons that make sense in the story, or if they're just stumbling across. Maybe you're cutting back and forth because of because they had to stop and you had to do a take, and you want that story to feel fluid in post. We'll cover post later on how we process these. So I need it to be either 30 degrees around, meaning one camera is going to be further away from the other one to get more of a profile or a lower angle or something unique, or I need one of them to be way wide and the other one to be really tight. So it doesn't do you any good to have the camera side by side and be shooting the same thing. So if you only have two 85 primes, I can move one camera to another angle and get a more unique shot. And in this case, we have a tight shot as well as a different composition set up for a different angle. So you want to make sure that you're not being redundant with the two cameras if you are going to go with the two camera setup. So it's way tighter, even too tight, but we don't have time to mess with all of that. But it's also giving us a unique perspective of some sort. The other thing, when we're talking about just pure height, eye level's really good to have a nice neutral shot. Feels conversational. Most people you talk to are going to be roughly eye level, depending on your scenario. I don't really want it to feel like the camera's standing. If I'm all the way up here and he's sitting and I'm talking down to him, it's not going to feel very conversational. And again, everything's subjective. Depending on how you are going about your particular story, you might try something a little different. And so that's really for you to decide. But know what that means. If you're looking down to someone, then is there a reason that you are lording over them, having that power? If you're looking up to someone, is there a reason that you need to have that godlike angle? Are you trying to make them look really powerful? Think of like Leni Riefenstahl shooting Triumph of the Will for Hitler. Every angle she shot was very low so that he felt like he was, godlike to them. Think about where your height's at and why and how that is in conjunction with your eyes of your actor, your talent. It's one of the reasons why I don't like interviewing people on a tall director chair, because it just kind of adds more elements. Rocking chairs, chairs with wheels, computer chairs, those are two definite no-nos. Again, if you got an old guy and he went through the Great Depression and that's your story and he isn't getting out of that rocking chair, accommodate him, work with it. But you should be getting comfortable as a producer and a storyteller to find that diplomacy there, that negotiating skill. Like, get to know them, talk to them. I talked about my friend. Took him a couple of years before he'd get his subject on camera because he just didn't trust anybody. Let's talk a little bit about the lights. Let's get him back to what would be kind of a clean frame that I would personally like, more or less. If anything, especially if my subject is pretty neutral. Our documentary Stonehaven had 17 interviews, and of those interviews, some of the people fixed the chimney. Some of them were an author who wrote a book on the house that we were in. Nobody was controversial. Nobody was, it wasn't like a Trump versus Biden documentary craziness or something. So I like to shoot them just slight, if I can, maybe a little wide in this case. to start off, have kind of an establishing if I want to see that location. That story was about an old apple orchard, so it's kind of cool to be at the house where it was all built around. But I have the ability, if I'm going to export in 1080p, because that's all that camera will do, unless you upscale it in After Effects, whole other thing for another day, I'm going to probably export in 1080. Camera 1 is shooting ultra high def. That means it's really camera 1 and camera 2, because I can punch in at 50% and not lose quality. So that makes the EVA 1, camera 2, and then my side angle, camera 3. That gives me a lot of versatility in post. Media is pretty cheap anymore. It's pretty accessible. There's no reason you can't shoot 4K if your camera isn't capable of it. That's not all encompassing, because like I said yesterday, I specifically shot in 1080 because it was an advisor training and it wasn't exactly something that needed some cool formats. I need exposure. I have no story without light, unless you're doing a podcast. I really need that light to just get enough light into the sensor so that we can see who's talking and what they're saying and to develop that story. But immediately after I get to that point, the light is going to evoke all of your emotion. Now, you might do an interview that has movement. I particularly hate moving cameras around my subject. And just as we just wrapped up the camera movement assignment, that movement better be motivated and not just a really, really bored camera op with nothing else to do. I like to have them on sticks, tripods, so that I can let them tell the story and then I can assemble it in post. So I want my cameras stagnant. I don't want them moving. I don't want them shaking. Maybe have a third angle that gets like hands or gestures. We like to do that if we have the space and the crew and the cameras. But ultimately, I want them stagnant, staying still. So I'm going to evoke most of my emotion through, hold still for a second, or you're going to drive me insane. I want to invoke my emotion through the light. So let's look at this. We're going to start with a 3-point light setup, okay? Right here. And I've actually talked to Allied Health last year about if they had any old mannequins around so that we could get our light set up, practicing with not having one of our crew members having to move around. So have you guys looked at 3-point lighting setups? It's pretty standard. You can do 2. You can do a single. You can do natural light. I particularly use the 3-point lighting setup most of the time. Now that is going to include my key light. Let me kill this. One really important thing you should do when lighting a scene is what I didn't do, right? And don't put all the lights on at once. You want to add lights one at a time. This will be our key light. It's our most powerful light. It's the one that's driving him crazy right now. Let me kill that down so don't blind your subject or they're not going to, I'm doing the temperature right now. This is your HBO, war crime, orphans on the street documentary setup. One heavy light, literally a two-face, what I refer to it as. I don't typically like, I've actually seen one interview years and years ago, it was at least a 20-year-old interview, where I couldn't see the other side of the guy's face. It was that dramatic. To the extent that I felt it was actually hurting the emotion because I couldn't see the reaction on the other side, but it was super dramatic. And you would actually need to add like a Duvetine or something that actually catches light so it doesn't bounce back to do that. And take a really long time to set up, even though it looks like you literally just went in a dark room and just turned on one light. So this is the very dramatic off to the side. I want a lot of emotion. I want to make some people cry. I want to make some people mad, something like that. When I start to move it, look at our shadows. As I start to move it around, we already start to get a little more out of the scene. Now these little lights, little GVMs, they're cheap little lights, but they work so great. I'm also in the same color temp. I'm at 5600. I could go warmer. I could go colder. Whatever feels comfortable. So that's one light. And then I'm going to add in, because I don't want it to be quite that emotional. I want it to be a little, I want it to have a little more, less shadows, less hard shadows. Okay, go ahead and, the other thing I should have mentioned already, because the light's already on, so I didn't. Striking, you always say striking, whether you're turning them on or turning them off. And often people forget for on, but they remember because that'll really upset your team. But you also want to make sure you say when you're turning them off, because someone might be depending on that light while they're wrapping a cord or stepping over something. So that communication, that verbal communication is incredibly vital while on set. So striking Andrew, watch your eyes. The other thing I like to do is have the lights, depending on the scenario, the story with eyeglasses or the emotion trying to evoke. I like to have my lights about eye level a lot of the time. There's certain exceptions to that. But if I usually start somewhere around eye level for those. And that's going to change how your, let's look from this one for now. It's going to change how your shadows fall across their face. So if his, go ahead and look right at that chair for me. So wherever it's going is going to change kind of how that, just like the sun moving across the sky kind of thing. So about eye level is where I at least like to start. Doesn't mean you have to end there, but it is a good place to start. And especially if they do have eyeglasses, sometimes moving that light higher or lower can try and get that through. The other thing I like about these lights too is they also take battery power. So if you are in a location that maybe has 2-prong outlets or no power at all, but do this way before your talent gets there. Don't make them sit through this. Have someone set in. Don't waste their time. You've got to get them out. And we'll get into story here in a second, but part of that leads into being ready when they get there. So very important that if you can light it the day before, have everything tested the day before, they will be more likely to say yes later and tell their friends and things of that nature. So here, go ahead and look back at that chair. So this is where your fill light, this is my fill. I can go what we call high key lighting where I don't want any shadows, what you see in news, what you see in like a sports commentator, something like that. No shadows, they just want the story, just want their talent, and they want to talk about what's there. But I like to have emotion, I like my fill light to fill in the shadows but not kill them all off. And again, this is subjective, and your story is going to be yours. This is just how I do it, and I want you to make it your own, so depending on how you choose to do so. So I like a little bit of fill so that it's not super dramatic. If I'm interviewing a student on why they came to HCC, I don't really want that HBO, sex trafficking documentary. I want it to be like very much a warmer environment. And then the last thing that I might add, if I want to go for the full, 3-point lighting, we call this a hair light. It's not perfectly where I would do it. You could go, some people like to go just the key light and then just the fill light. Can give you that Rembrandt feel for a 2-point lighting. And they have natural 1, 2, 3, and 4-point lighting. Typically what I like to go, especially if they have a hat on, I want to get that, I want to keep that top light, that hair light can easily start casting another shadow. So you just got to work within what your subject is. I would also tell them not to wear a hat if that's not really their identity all the time. What do you think this hair light does? What's something that hair light does if you were going to take a guess? It's separating him from the background a little more because our background isn't as much lit as what we have for Andrew himself. So when he's like that, he kind of falls into the background a bit. I throw in that hair light, and if it was angled a little better, not exactly, it's also hitting the back. If I was to do it the right way, or another way, is I might have that light back here shooting this way. And when I have more time, because I would have set this up before my talent got here, I could position one of these TV grid lights to angle this direction and not get the back. But that helps isolate him from the background. It's especially important when the background is like this and has no additive to the story. It doesn't help the story, so I want a shallow depth of field, and that light can also help convey that. So it's not perfect. I'd tinker with it more if I had more time, but it's not bad. You can also add color. Sometimes I do this with, when we interviewed the football coach about the national championship game. I'm going to do some adjustment here. So I might throw in a little color, a little red or a little blue. I don't want it to be my key light though. I want that to be my fill light or my hair light typically. And I have done the fill light red and the hair light blue kind of thing too. What could be a problem with that? It's that red and blue make purple. So who's our rival? Butler, their color, purple. The last thing I wanted was a football coach having a purple haze over his head. the wrong image that I wanted to send across. So you can use things, especially when you're trying to do something like that. Your barn doors, I don't have them on that one, but barn doors can help direct that light so that maybe the red and the blue don't crisscross right over his head. And so it just depends. Again, I wanted to make sure I had that all hashed out way before I wasted the football coach's time, so that way they would be more likely to say yes next time for us, right? Any thoughts? All right, we're not doing bad on time because that usually is, like I said, the most things to consider, the most elements happening, and really where a lot of stuff can go wrong. But this stuff you can live with going wrong too, because like I said, it is subjective and it's not always exactly the way you want. But I think this would work if I was just trying to do a quick interview, if I was going to get a real opinion on why Andrew picked HCC in the media program, I'd find a better background. A couple things to consider that I ran into in the audio equipment realm. Media, this one won't take above a 32 gig SD card, micro SD card. If you put in something higher, 64, so on and so forth, then it's going to, then it's not going to read it and it just starts flashing. That's this particular model. Our F6 Zoom recorders, they have 256 cards, 128 cards that come with them, and that will record audio for a couple of days. So a couple of things, will you rifle that up your shirt for me, please? So I don't have to. This is usually the most awkward part of production, is getting someone laved up. And hopefully they're okay with doing it themselves, but help them. If you have a little old lady at an old folks home that's 101, there's a shoot we did this summer, my oldest interview so far, you still got to help them out, be professional about it, be polite. Now he did a good job of what I would prefer. I always go where they can't. There's a couple things here. First off, it's up the shirt. It's not a distraction on camera. I don't mind seeing the lav. That's okay for me. I can live with seeing it because it's nonfiction. This is life. This is real. Some people put a big wind thing on it if they're out interviewing Border Patrol or something. I don't know. And then you got this thing kind of flowing in their face. I try to divert that if I can. Sometimes we'll go up the back and through a collar if we can sneak that in. Another reason why I really like my talent to be sitting so that they're not moving around a whole lot. But also, if this cord is running down the front, it's not only an eyesore, they will mess with it. They won't even know it. They're nervous. They'll start tinkering with it. They'll start, playing with it. And if they don't do that, inevitably they're going to do a hand gesture and it's going to get caught on them, and then they're pulling it off. It's just super distracting. So either up the back and around or up the shirt, either or, pretty standard, pretty easy. I find these cheap little lavs work great. They're not connected into my camera, so I have to have what we call a clapper. I want to match audio, and I want to let myself or my editor or my producer, whoever, just know which person it was. We've done 10, 12 in a day on multiple occasions, just going through interview after interview. Don't assume you're going to remember. When you have them sign their contract or their release form, then you want to get that name spelled correctly and maybe even what their experience is, carpenter, painter, wife, spouse, whatever, state senator, whatever you're interviewing, maybe that'll help you just stay a little organized. I typically don't have different takes and cuts. I like the way I conduct an interview. So this is really important for me. So this lav going to a micro SD card talks to these other cameras very easily and not having to, like what Zoe gets stuck doing on our little lectures, syncing up my lips with trying to match a hand gesture between two cameras. It's such a pain. Don't do that to yourself. Now the other thing, I want to get it in focus. I need to see that it's in focus. Sorry, a little intrusive. Always have a couple of markers, and I like really bulk up. Black's great if I can, but I need to be able to see it. My handwriting's really terrible too, so that's a little bright. I'd probably need to bring down my light a bit. My key's a little heavy here anyways. Make sure it's in focus. Your cam op should be able to tell you that. Make sure it's not reflecting. Something you can do if it's super dark, night scene, we had to do this in Atlanta last year. this thing is translucent. You can shoot a flashlight through and actually see what's written on it in the dark way easier than just trying to blast like a cell phone light on it. But essentially, I need to see it, but I don't need to smack this thing right into his face. That will throw people off, and especially if you have an actor, they might forget their line. I've absolutely seen that. So we do what's called soft sticks, and we just drop it. That will spike. Watch the camera. See that in the bottom left? That's still spiking, and it's not rude. Now, if I'm not right into his face, and say we're blocking, he's going to walk into the scene or something, then I want to really smack that thing, and I like to see the red peak because that means I'm definitely going to see that in post really fast. My editor's going to appreciate that from you. But yeah, soft sticks. If you forget to do the slate, really common, then you can do what we call as a tail slate, and you just come in at the end, maybe go upside down, so then they realize tail slate, it's at the end. Now, you don't want to do this, but that's still better than no slate, by far. The reason I really like to slate at the beginning, if you look on Premiere Pro or DaVinci, created thumbnails come off the first frame, that slate will show on all of our thumbnails so you can see your different interviewers and you don't have to look at just an image file. Because it's going to say A00156778 on the EVA1. It's going to say C blah, 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 blah on that. It's not going to say Andrew in your camera. This is going to speed up that process and your team will appreciate you a little more. And again, I'm going to require slates on every project next semester. And it's really easy to forget them. It's one of those things I tend to forget a lot. What do I do when I forget them? Does anybody know my redneck way of fixing this? Yeah? Okay. Andrew. Now, you don't have to use a lav. Lavs are my favorite. I'm laved up now. I think lavs are great for a lot of reasons. And because all of you are either in or just took audio, I don't want to go too far in depth into that for the time that we have left. A shotgun mic with a boom pole is a great option. A shotgun mic on top of your camera, not great, but better than the in-camera audio. And so depending on what you work with and what you have, audio is the most important thing. I get so sucked into image from my background in photography and passion for it, but if your audio is scratchy, your audio is off, your audio is too high, too low, your audience will check out faster because of audio. This has actually been studied. They will walk out of a theater quicker because of audio than a bad image, okay? So you have to get clean audio. That is the most important. We have nothing if we don't have audio. So maybe it shouldn't be number 4 on the priorities, but as far as time and everything, it's really easy to do right. It's something that you should have an allocated person to help you for that if you're able to, and in some cases, a couple. They might need an assistant too. Now, let's talk real quick, not about the equipment involved, but about, we've been talking composition and placement as far as the wall, lighting, where we put our cameras, where we're putting our subject. From the director's standpoint, audio needs to have a say. I like to be on this end of the room when I do interviews if I can. Anybody know why? The street is a big one. Harleys, diesels, emergency vehicles, those can absolutely ruin a take. The only person who can cut me in a scene when I'm directing, outside of the talent because they need something or they're concerned about something, is the audio person. If your camera, even audio, I like, if I hear somebody going by, we have nonverbal things that we try to communicate to see, is that affecting you? Did you hear that? Was that coming through? Helicopters are a pain, come out of nowhere real fast. And if I can look at my audio person and they're like, no, we're good, it's not intrusive, then we keep going. Audio can cut us immediately if it's ruining the shot. What sucks is if they're in a really emotional thing that they're saying, and that's where I really like to check on my audio person to see, are you still getting the story, or do we need to stop and refocus that thought? If I'm talking, if I'm asking a question or something conversational, then I definitely want them to stop me so that we can just immediately pause, take a moment, let that semi go by, and we keep going. The other thing is inside the room. You have all the air ducts back here. You want to be as far on the other third. There's a lot of thirds, there's a lot of threes in media and film, I want to be as far to this third of the room as I can from my microphones. Especially with my directional shotgun mics that could be facing away or even tilted just slightly away from the furnaces. Like in this particular building, it's a lot harder to control that than it is like my house, for instance. So, and we did have a scenario, this didn't happen to me, it happened to a friend. They were conducting interviews throughout a day in Wichita, and there was a manhunt in the area, and the helicopter just kept circling for hours. So that's probably worst case scenario that I'm aware of. I don't think anything's gone quite that bad on any of my shoots, but talk about something that you can't control, you have to adapt to, you have to be patient with, because everything in filmmaking is about attitude, about work ethic, about getting along, and it's certainly about adaptability and patience. And you as director, you as producer, as the person in charge of gathering this story, is the most important to keep your composure. When that stuff's happening, it's okay to be frustrated, but you better not make it so that it's ruining it for everyone. You better try to pull them through, because you're where the story stops and dies if you're conducting that orchestra there. So documentary will test your patience. There is no doubt about that. There's nothing that I've experienced that's more difficult than trying to piece together all these puzzle pieces for an end result that you're not even quite sure what you're going to know about until post, potentially. So I think that's about what I wanted to cover with audio. Nothing too crazy, especially been in audio. Joey's covered a lot of that, I'm sure. But keep in mind, audio is not like light. These barn doors can divert light. I can tell that lens exactly where I want it to focus. Audio doesn't play by those same rules. It goes through walls, it bleeds, it goes around corners. All those it's good to have signs if you can. If you're in a public building, set up some signage around so that people understand that they may not walk into the set, they may not walk on the scene, but they can still ruin the take. So it doesn't hurt to put up just a sign that says filming in progress, please be quiet. So here's an audio guy that I follow on Instagram. He created quiet please signs, and he's selling like them by the thousands. Just these little like pop-up little signs that he would just take with him on set, and then he started selling them, and it became kind of a source of income for him. There's a lot of different types of audio devices, as there is a lot of different lights in the building. So depending on what works best for you or what you have on you, get acclimated to it, run tests, test it out before you have your team there, your actor there, and make sure that you're organized that way. All right, let's go into the most important thing that I saved for last that we'll probably be discussing the entire time. We'll talk about this a lot in the post workshop as well. But in this particular case, the story is everything. It's the whole reason we set up these cameras and these lights and put him in this spot and lobbed him up, is that we had a story. This is all a waste if you don't have at least double digits, 10 good questions. And I'm not talking about what is your name, how old are you? Dig into that. I think all 10 questions, depending on your subject, need to have 3 potential sub-questions. So if you say, oh, are you an artist? I am an artist, okay. What's your motivation? What's the kind of work do you do? You like using pastels? Do you like doing watercolors? You need to have a conversation, you make it work. And this also doesn't just go with having great prepped questions. And there isn't anyone on earth that can't be looked up. And do a little backstory. When I interviewed Daryl Pope this summer, Zoe and I did, the longest running chapter president for the NAACP, I didn't just wing it. I Googled him, found out he met Obama in 2009, found out that he started his first year in the NAACP within a year of Martin Luther King being assassinated. That's one hell of a kickoff for a conversation. And then 40 years later, he gets to meet Obama. Imagine like how that timeline goes, and then I could fill in those pieces. That was one really, really strong interview. It was really powerful, and I didn't just wing it. It was super important to me to first have him say yes, but then it was incredibly important for me to not waste his time and honor that this is a very historical person. His dad was also a chapter president of the NAACP for 10 years. I found all that on the internet. I didn't have to go do a pre-interview, which is nice if you can. It's great when you can meet these people ahead of time, even if it's just a phone call or emails or text messages, something. But if you can't, and in his case, I had no contact. He's pretty old school. I think he just has a landline. So I had to do a little research. It won't hurt you, and it'll make you feel so much more comfortable and confident when you sit down with someone important like that. And if you're interviewing someone like a politician or an athlete and they have this aura around them, it can make you nervous, and you need to have confidence to get that story. Research can do that. Research will make you better on set. Let's talk about how you conduct that. It's really important not to ask one-word questions. You need to ask questions that will invoke conversation, or at least a sentence or a phrase. Don't say, "How old are you?" And he goes, 18. I have nothing. I have nothing at that point. Coach them, work with them. I am 18 years old. Don't just say, "Where are you from?" Wichita. Say, "I am from Wichita." You got to get them to tell their story if you're going to do expository. And that's my particular one that I'm very passionate about. Now, not to say if Dayton does the crazy Granny Brigade out of Salina, that you couldn't invoke yourself in the story as a Jordan Kepler type going in with the microphone and talking, because you're a funny guy. You could make that enjoyable. That's not my style. That's not how I work. And that's why most of my work is expository or poetic. And because of that, I want to make sure that I can find that story either through that image or through that dialogue and that conversation. So it's very important. As I start to wrap this up, one of the other things that's extremely important is be cognizant of time. If you start hearing things like I said, or as I said before, now we're getting redundant, and you're not getting more information, and they're going to get bored. If you're going over 30 minutes, then you better not hear those things. And it's very seldom that I get over 30 minutes on a very organized interview that I don't start hearing, as I said before. If you're doing that, then you're wasting somebody's time. And maybe it's your crew, maybe it's your talent, or maybe it's your editor, but under a half hour is usually pretty strong. And at that point, if there is more to have, take a little break. Let everyone have a bathroom break, check their phones, get some water, and then kind of process. And sometimes we come back days later. Maybe we'll go in and we'll watch that interview and say, I would like to cover this a little heavier, maybe something there. But I find a half hour, you get over an hour, over a half hour, it starts to get a little dry. And the files start to get large, and everything starts to become you end up using a lot less of your media after that first half hour. I find in the first 15 minutes, you usually have most of your gold. Now, that is not all encompassing. Again, this is documentary. All these things that I'm telling you aren't rules. These are just experiences I've had. I've interviewed someone for 2.5 hours, and he had me crying and laughing the entire time. He was incredible. I don't even know how I will cut that interview. Hell, I might just release it as a 2.5 hour interview on YouTube and let people watch it. You never know. In the case of Jaden's uncle, I've interviewed him so many times now that some have been better than others. I'd say our last one was probably the most emotional. Michael actually cried. I've interviewed him 5 times. He's never cried before. So sometimes it takes some time to break into that mold, but I still didn't want any of those interviews to go an hour and a half because I wouldn't have got that emotion with more time. Documentaries take a lot longer in production time, typically, or very, very much shorter. You could shoot an interview, do a demo, and have it edited by the end of the day in some cases, or like in the case of Michael's story, I interviewed him the first time in 2018. We've traveled to Colombia, we've traveled to Africa, we've taken a train to Chicago to stay with him, and we've interviewed him here. That story has been piecing together over time, but we did our initial short film over the course of a couple weeks in 2018. So all of them, it's not all encompassing, there's not a great cookie cutter for documentary, and it's what makes it really special. But for these, try to keep your talent under a half hour. If it's your grandfather, if it's your spouse, if it's a local artist, if it's someone from a nonprofit, you can get a lot of information in 15 minutes. And like I said, you start with that short one, process it, look at it, take a little break, and come back. So I like to run straight through. I don't like to do a lot of cuts and stops. I like to let my cameras run. I don't do my interviews on 35 or 16 millimeter ever. I always do digital. So I have the ability to let those, I think the C100 has so much media in it, it could run for 4 hours. So just let it go and figure that out in post. Not ideal, it's gonna take a lot of time, but you don't wanna stop and start your talent over and over and over again, it'll throw them off. But you get 15 to 30 minutes of a good interview, that's somewhere that you can stop and process, say, okay, how's it going? Maybe we got everything, let's check it out. I think that's a good standard. 45 minutes to an hour, it's seldom that it's usable material at that point. Almost always we ended up not using much from that particular juncture. Especially if you line up 10 in a row, then you only need probably 10 to 15 minutes on what their specific scenario is tied to that story.